This is the Biblical Unitarian Podcast.
Greetings, friends, and welcome again to the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, the podcast that aims to start conversations about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. My name is Dustin Smith, and as always, I will be your host. This week we got episode 330 entitled, "The Agent is Subordinate to the Sender." So 3 weeks ago, we introduced the Jewish principle of agency, and I've been getting a lot of really good feedback from these episodes. And in that initial episode, we discussed 6 aspects of the principle of agency. We've been going through them one by one, and this week we're going to examine the third of these tenets, which is that the agent is subordinate to his principal, namely the sender. Or you could word this in the sense that the sender is greater than the agent. So, how did the relationship between the sender and the agent play out with the agent's subordinate status? Who were the typical agents within Judaism, and who were the typical senders within Judaism? And how does Jesus Christ function as the subordinate agent of God in the past, in the present, and in the future? Let's find out on this week's episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast. Our first point today is defining our terms. It's very important to make sure that we are all clear on the definitions of the words that we are looking at. So, the sender is the one that, of course, selects a qualified agent. The sender invests that agent with the sender's authority, with the sender's status, the sender's prerogatives, and then the sender is going to send forth that agent on a mission. The sender is also called the principal, not to be confused with the principle of agency. This is the principal, Principal, the principal. And the agent is the principal's agent. So the sender sends forth the agent on a mission. Now, in the Jewish Encyclopedia, the entry entitled Law of Agency notes that this particular principle deals with the status of the agent who is acting by direction of the sender. And that's really important. The principle of agency is primarily about recognizing the status of the agent. And that's why we spent so much time last week looking at the fact that the agent fully represents the judicial roles of the sender because he bears the status of the sender. And the first principle that we looked at involved the agent fully representing the sender. It all comes down to status. So the primary sender in the Bible is, of course, the God of Israel. And he sends forth many agents. He sends forth heavenly angels. We can see this in Genesis chapter 19, verses 13 through 15. A passage that some people think points to two Yahwehs, but the reality is that we have angels who are agents that represent the sender, God, in every possible way. We, of course, have the famous passage in Exodus 23, verses 20 through 21, where Yahweh says of his angelic messenger that my name is in him. And then we have the angels in Daniel chapter 10, verse 11, who represent God fully. God also sends human prophets. In particular, God sends forth Moses as a prophet. We can see this in the book of Exodus. Prophets are sent forth according to Psalm 105. Of course, in Isaiah chapter 6, we have the commissioning of the prophet Isaiah. Who's going to go for us? And Isaiah responds by saying, "Here I am, Lord, send me." We have the sending of Jeremiah and his commissioning in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 7. The commissioning of Ezekiel in chapter 2, verse 3. The prophet Micah is sent in chapter 6, verse 4. And the prophet Malachi is sent in chapter 3, verse 23. I really shouldn't have to point out that prophets are sent, especially when they are the ones that are saying, "Thus says the Lord." They are not the Lord himself. They are just speaking on his behalf because they are human spokespersons for God. There's an interesting question as to whether the priest represent God or they represent the people who are bringing forth the sacrifice. They, of course, function as these sort of intermediary figures. And this question as to whether the priest represents God, who mediates the forgiveness to the people, or the people that bring the sacrifice, is raised in the Babylonian Talmud. And Rabbi Huna settled the matter once and for all by arguing that God appointed the priest to bring the sacrifices. And so, the priests function as agents of God, not of the people. So it's an interesting point, thinking that the priests are human agents of God, mediating the forgiveness to the people. And of course, that has some bearing on Jesus as the high priest right now. God sends forth his Spirit when the Spirit is personified. We can see this in Psalm 104, verse 30. So the Spirit functions as this personified agent of Yahweh. And I couldn't help but pointing out that God sends forth his personified attributes, like his personified wisdom and his personified word. So God sends forth this personified word in Psalm 107, verse 20, Psalm 147, verse 15, and verse 18. God sends forth his word even in the poetic parts of the prophets, like Isaiah chapter 9, verse 8, and Isaiah 55, verse 11. God sends forth his personified wisdom in Wisdom of Solomon chapter 9, verse 10, where Solomon prays to God and says, "Send forth your wisdom from heaven so that she may sit at my side." Now, wisdom and word are not the only personified attributes of God that are sent. God sends forth many of his attributes. He sends forth his burning anger and many other ones. Exodus chapter 15, verse 7 is one example of that. So, very clearly, God is the primary sender of the Bible. He sends forth angels, prophets, priests, his Spirit, and personified attributes like his personified wisdom and his personified word. Human kings and rulers could also send forth agents. They would very commonly send forth envoys. A king himself is not going to go out and deliver a message to someone else. No, of course, he's going to send forth a messenger. He's going to send forth an envoy. Masters could send forth their hired laborers. That makes sense. A boss could send forth an employee. And parents could send forth their children to do common things like go to the store and buy something. That was a really common thing in Judaism. So in Mark chapter 12, verse 6, in the parable of the wicked tenants, sometimes it's called the parable of the vineyard, it says that the sender is sending forth his son, and that surely they will listen to the son. So that's important to realize in regard to human parents sending forth their children. It's very clear, by the way, that when a king sends forth an envoy, that the envoy is subordinate to the king. When a master sends forth a hired employee, the employee, of course, is subordinate to that master, even though they're both humans. And parents sending forth children, they're both human, but it's clear that the parents outrank the children in the Jewish world. It should work that way today, but parenting is quite questionable. Now, how does an agent actually get sent? Well, the appointment of an agent in the Jewish principle of agency could take place simply with spoken words. The sender could just send forth the agent and just tell him, "I'm sending you on this mission, go do this," and that's all that is necessary. There wasn't a need for any formal writing, nor was there need for any witnesses to be present in order to verify the relationship between the agent and the sender. Now, if the agent was questioned in regard to what he was doing, he would have to defend himself by calling attention to the fact that he was the agent, and he would have to identify who his sender actually was. This, of course, has a lot of bearing on the portrayal of Jesus in the Gospel of John. Now, the agent of the sender had to meet some qualifications in the Jewish principle of agency. And the general rule that we can summarize is that the agent has to have the capacity to both legally and mentally act on behalf of him or herself. So a small child, being of unsound mind, would not possess the necessary legal knowledge to function as an agent. So you couldn't send forth like a 10-year-old to be your agent. If someone was a deaf mute, of course, they could not qualify. If there was a Gentile in the land of Israel, an Israelite person could not send forth a Gentile because there were limitations on foreigners and aliens. They could not function as the agent of a Jew. Now, it wouldn't matter if the agent was a woman or a man. They were both qualified in that sense. The role of the agent is not limited to males. Marital status also would not disqualify somebody if they were otherwise suitable. And even a bondwoman of an Israelite could serve as the agent of that Israelite sender. A slave, whether the slave was male or female, could be an agent. Hired laborers were very commonly agents of their masters, and it was very common, of course, for adult children within a household to be sent as agents. They couldn't be young children, they had to be adult children. Now, out of all of these agents, the best candidate to be sent was the father's adult son. There was no better agent that could be selected than one's own son. And that, of course, is very important when it comes to the portrayal of Jesus in the New Testament, because he is the Son of God, and so he is the most appropriate agent that God could send. He is more appropriate than a heavenly angel. He's more appropriate than a basic prophet, than a priest. The unique Son of God is the most qualified agent of a father. So let's move to our second point, which is the sender is greater than his agent. So, when the sender or the principal commissions forth his agent, the shaliach, the agent is naturally subordinate in that relationship. The agent has to obey the mission for which he is sent. And this mutual understanding between the agent and the principal was very crucial to completing the mission, to bringing the mission to an end. In Genesis Rabbah, chapter 78, it says quite explicitly, the sender is greater than the one who is sent. That much is clear. These are not two co-equal persons. However, if I don't point this out, someone in the comments is going to mention this to me. There were a few occasions where there really is no discernible difference in rank or status between the agent and the principal prior to the commissioning, such as when a husband would send an agent to announce the annulment of his marriage. This is just an adult male who sends forth another adult male to function as the agent in the announcement of the annulment of the marriage of the sender. There's no sense that the agent is subordinate to the initial husband. They're just two guys. And this is the most common exception, but in the act of the agent functioning as the agent, he of course has to submit himself to the sender. but the most common scenario took place between a sender who ranked higher than the agent. The understanding that the rabbis drew from in order to recognize that the husband could commission an agent to announce the annulment of the marriage is from Deuteronomy chapter 24, the first 4 verses. That's 24 verses 1 through 4. The verb shaliach, which is the Hebrew verb to send, from which we get the noun for the one who is sent, the shaliach. That verb appears 3 times over the course of 4 verses. And so the rabbis discerned from this passage the principle of agency therein. And even Jesus seemed to recognize this when he said that you would send a note of divorce, and that Moses talked about this. Now, we already mentioned that a ruler would not deliver a message himself. A ruler or a king would send forth a messenger. He would send forth an envoy. And in that relationship, there really was no question as to who was the greater person. Very clearly, the master was the ruler. It was not the envoy or the agent. In the Babylonian Talmud's tractate Baba Kama 113b, it says that the agent of the ruler is as the ruler himself. This is, of course, because the agent fully represents the ruler, but the agent, of course, is not the ruler himself. The ruler is the greater party, and the agent is someone who is subordinate to that. But when the agent represents the ruler, he, of course, bears the status of the ruler as the functioning agent. In the first century, Philo Judaeus refers to the agent of the master as a servant. And it's quite clear that any will or agenda that belonged to the agent was naturally set aside in order to give room to the greater will that belonged to the sender. That much is absolutely clear. So having set forth our definitions and talked about the people that could be senders and the people that could function as agents, we can now look to the Gospel of John. This is point number 3, where the Johannine Jesus is subordinate to the only true God. It's very clear that in the Gospel of John, God is the one who has sent Jesus, and Jesus is the one who has been sent by God. This relationship involving the verbs to send, apostello and pimpo, respectively, in Greek, appear over 40 times. And when you depict the relationship between a sender and his agent as the one who sent and the one who has been sent over 40 times, it's quite clear that that is something that's very important to you. The Gospel of John wants to portray Jesus as the true agent of God. And so the Father who sent Jesus on his messianic mission is, of course, greater than Jesus the agent. And this should be pretty plainly self-evident because the Gospel of John repeatedly describes Jesus as a human being, as a man. And Jesus will freely admit that he is a human being. In John chapter 8, verse 40, he says that he is a man who heard the truths from God. Jesus admits openly and plainly, without any qualification, that he is a human being. He doesn't say that I grabbed on some divine nature at my incarnation. No, he says that he is a human being in the same way that you and I are human beings. God, on the other hand, is described by Jesus as the Father, and the Father is called the only true God, the person to whom Jesus prayed. That's John 17, verse 3. So we have the sender as the only true God, as defined by the agent, and the agent is a human being. Then it's very clear that the agent is subordinate to the sender. We shouldn't even have to be saying this self-evident, clear truth. Now you'll remember in John 17:3 that we have eternal life linked with knowing the Father as the only true God, but also knowing Jesus Christ, and then there's a connection between the two of them. What is the connection between the only true God and Jesus Christ? Jesus Christ is the one whom the only true God has sent. So you have to see Jesus as the agent of the only true God. And very clearly, if you're the agent of the only true God, you bear, through the principle of agency, a lot of privileges and prerogatives by bearing the status of your sender. Now, Jesus taught his disciples very clearly that the Father is greater than Jesus. He says this in John 14:28, where Jesus openly says, without qualification, the Father is greater than I. And even Catholic scholars admit that we have to read this as the clear subordination of the Son. Raymond Brown's commentary in the Anchor Bible Commentary makes this point quite clear. I encourage you to look into that. It's the second of 2 volumes. And of course, Jesus has a God, and he says that his God is the Father in John 20, verse 17. Now, since all fathers in the ancient Near East were universally regarded as greater than their sons in rank, it is not surprising that we find the very same tenet in the Gospel of John, particularly as the Gospel of John portrays God and Jesus. God and Jesus in the Gospel of John are the Father and the Son. And since all fathers outrank their sons, and all sons are subordinate to their fathers, it's quite clear that Jesus, the agent of God, is one who is subordinate to the sender. Now, Anthony Harvey, in his article entitled Christ as Agent, says that the Son functioning as the agent of his Father par excellence, quote, was empirically the case in ancient Middle Eastern commerce, end quote. The agent of the Father, who is the Son, was the agent par excellence, and this was the universally understood way in which the Son functioned as the agent of the Father in the ancient Near East. Now, some people will respond by saying that, well, the pre-existent Son gave up his co-equality in order to be subordinate while he was the agent of the Father on earth. However, after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, when the mission was over, when Jesus was no longer the agent, his commissioning had been complete. The New Testament writers still portray Jesus as subordinate to God. We can see this in Paul quite clearly, 1 Corinthians 3, verse 23, where Christ belongs to God after his resurrection. In 1 Corinthians 11, verse 3, Paul says that he wants his readers to know and understand that God is the head of Christ. And when Jesus hands over the kingdom to the Father, he's going to be subject to the Father for all eternity. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 28. Jesus, of course, right now is the mediator between the one God and humanity. That's 1 Timothy 2:5. And we can see in Ephesians 4:6 that the one God and Father is over all. All, of course, includes everyone else, namely anyone who's not the Father, which would be the Son. So, Jesus was subordinate as the agent of God. After the mission was over, he remains subordinate. He is subordinate right now. And when he hands the kingdom over to the Father, he's going to be subordinate eternally. He'll be subject to the Father forever. So this is not some co-equal son to the Father, because again, I have to keep pointing this out, all fathers outranked their sons, and even though the Son was the best agent that a father could have, all sons were subordinate to the sender, and that includes even Jesus Christ. Thank you so much for tuning to this week's episode. Join us next week as we examine the fourth tenet of the Jewish principle of agency, namely, the agent is fully obedient to the sender. Please look forward to our next episode. If you enjoy the Biblical Unitarian podcast, please consider supporting us as we aim to promote the sound truths about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. You, of course, can support us by purchasing our new book on the Christology of the Gospel of John called Wisdom Christology in the Gospel of John. You can support us for free by simply subscribing on YouTube or iTunes and giving us an honest review on iTunes. If you like a particular episode, you can support us by sharing it with your friends on social media. If you'd like to offer a tip or a donation, check out the episode's description for a PayPal link. The Biblical Unitarian podcast is produced and edited by Dustin Williams. I am Dustin Smith, your host. Until next time, please take care.